By January of 20 AD, the stage was set. Rome herself lay calm, but simmering, the quiet before an inevitable storm. Seated amid the marble splendor of his Palatine villa, Tiberius found himself surrounded by the trappings of power, wealth, luxury, security, symbols of Rome's stability that now felt like little more than hollow facades, revealing the illusions of power. Even as reports continued to arrive, each more troubling than the last, Tiberius continued to carry the heavy burden handed to him by his father. From the east came the news. Celenderis, once a minor fortress in Cilicia and prison to the late King Vonones of Armenia, was now transformed into a bastion of defiance. Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the former governor of Syria, with his wife Plancina by his side, was amassing an army, a volatile mixture of mercenaries, deserters, and slaves. These were not soldiers in Rome's image, loyal to the state. They were a rabble, loyal to the gold paid them by their commander. And yet, under Piso's direction, this army now posed a direct threat to Tiberius's authority as pater patriae. And still, even closer to Rome, Agrippina, Tiberius's daughter-in-law, had landed at Brundisium. Clutching Germanicus's ashes, and with her youngest children trailing behind her, Agrippina's pitiable progress through Italy was slowly taking on the gravity of a state procession. Crowds gathered, weeping at the sight of her anguish and voicing their own discontent. Each step she took along the Via Appia left in her wake the beginnings of a new movement, a kind of populism rooted not in rebellion, but in sorrow. If not properly contained, this swelling movement of grief threatened to erupt into a rallying cry that could rattle the foundations of Tiberius's rule. Only 5 years had passed since the divine Caesar Augustus entrusted Tiberius with safeguarding the sacred Pax Romana, a peace to which Augustus had devoted his life, his empire, and even members of his family. Now, with threats emerging from among the people and from within the Senate, Tiberius faced the grim possibility that the very stability his father had so painstakingly crafted could once again be sacrificed to the whims and fortunes of another civil war. But would that war come from the legions or the plebs? The will of the people had always been the weapon used by Tiberius's stepchildren to force the hands of those in power. Tiberius's ex-wife, Julia, alongside her mother Scribonia, had previously harnessed popular support, and in doing so had simultaneously secured Augustus's favour for Gaius Caesar, Tiberius's 14-year-old stepson. Later, Julilla attempted the same tactics on behalf of posthumous Agrippa. It was no surprise to Tiberius that the last of his stepchildren, Agrippina, woefully carrying the ashes of Germanicus across Italy, was now perfecting the art of public theatre. Each step she took toward Rome seemed to draw the empire's eyes away from the Eastern crisis and toward the image of the grieving widow, manipulating the people's sorrow to her advantage. But even more than the movements and motivations of Agrippina, Tiberius was bothered by the precision and the cunning with which Piso and Plancina had made their move. Someone had orchestrated Piso's initial meeting with King Aretas of the Nabateans, but who? What did Piso hope to gain before his meeting with the king who controlled the most populated trade routes in the east was interrupted by the arrival of Germanicus? As governor of Syria, Piso then threw his support behind Vonones, the king of Armenia, whose royal Parthian descent posed a direct threat to the non-royal King Artabanus of Parthia. Swiftly removing Vonones from Armenia's throne, Germanicus replaced him with King Artaxias, a man whose lineage held no claim to Parthia's throne. And yet Piso undermined Germanicus, refusing to dispatch legions which might have been necessary for Germanicus's safety. When Germanicus returned to Antioch and stripped Piso of his office for failing to follow his orders, Why had Piso travelled to the island of Kos instead of returning to Rome? What was he waiting for? Perhaps Piso had been biding his time for just this moment, the death of Germanicus, a chance to act. But to what end? Piso's swift actions, his demands for auxiliary legions from surrounding kings and governors, and his silence towards Rome amid the chaos, suggested a master plan, one just out of reach. But who was pulling the strings? At Celenderis, the armies met. Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso had dispatched Centurion Domitius Sella to rally Syria's Fulminata, Ferrata, and Gallica legions to his cause. And so, when the ships bearing these legions docked, Piso likely breathed a sigh of relief. Yet the legions that disembarked at Celenderis harbour and assembled below the fortress were not commanded by Sella, but by Gaius Sentius Saturninus. The acting governor appointed by Germanicus and confirmed by Tiberius had long suspected the motives of Sella, who had sailed for Kos immediately after the news of Germanicus's death. At Laodicea harbour, the same harbour that serviced the legion's winter camp of Raphanae, Sella was arrested. He would not sway the legions to Piso's side. Neither had King Sampsiceramus of Emesa nor King Aretas of the Nabateans delivered the auxiliary forces Piso had demanded. Instead, they pledged their legions to Gaius Sentius Saturninus, a loyal ally of Tiberius, whose authority as head of state ensured the security and stability both kingdoms relied on. The kings in the east, wary of the shifting political tides and the uncertainty of a new power in Rome, chose not to risk rebellion by supporting Piso's cause. Their loyalty lay with Tiberius, whose continuation of Augustus's administration had long ensured Rome's dominance in the region. Only the governor of Cilicia, Lucius Marcius Censorinus, sent any military support to Piso. But what choice did Censorinus have? Piso had already entrenched himself firmly within his province, leaving the governor little room to maneuver. In response, Censorinus dispatched a single legion of auxiliary soldiers accompanied by a note. The note explained, using the most apologetic terms, that he could not send his Roman legions to Piso. They were urgently needed to address the ongoing conflicts on the border of Pontus. Censorinus's position was precarious, and it was easy to understand his motivations. As governor of Cilicia, his command was far less prestigious, and thus inferior to that of the governor of Syria. By entering his province and demanding his legions, Piso had forced Censorinus's hand. While he was technically following orders from a more senior Senate member, Censorinus's involvement with Piso's cause presented a dilemma. Dragged into the situation by Piso's invasion of his province, Censorinus now had to negotiate his safe passage through without offending either Piso or Tiberius. His move to send only a single auxiliary unit, while apologetically withholding his true strength for border issues with Pontus, was a careful strategy which ensured that, regardless of the outcome of the conflict, Censorinus could position himself advantageously. If Piso succeeded, Censorinus could claim to have aided him. If Tiberius prevailed, Censorinus could explain his minimal contribution as a strict adherence to the law, but one which denied Piso the strength necessary to truly challenge Tiberius. Although Censorinus's actions demonstrated a political acumen reminiscent of Tiberius himself, it was clear that caution was paramount. In response to the growing instability in the east, Tiberius reinforced his authority by confirming Syria's governor, Gaius Sentius Saturninus, as acting governor of Cilicia as well, thereby placing the province's legions directly under his control. By putting Sentius Saturninus in command of both Cilicia's and Syria's legions, Tiberius ensured that Cilicia remained firmly aligned with the broader interests of the empire, as reflected by the support of kings Sampsiceramus and Aretas. With Censorinus dismissed, there was no longer any ambiguity surrounding Piso's support in the east. His deserters, mercenaries and slaves would have to suffice. Completely surrounded by an Anatolia and Syria unified behind Tiberius, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso had one chance left. The men gathered at the foot of his hill, now commanded by Sentius Saturninus, had once been his friends. Not only had he increased their pay and relaxed their discipline, but he had walked among them, dicing and drinking, learning their names, and asking after their families. All Piso needed to do was remind them of who he was. Standing before Celenderis, Piso shouted down the hill, calling many of the soldiers by name and reminding them of the relationships they had shared. Invoking the name of Augustus, with whom he had once been friends, Piso proclaimed his innocence in the death of Germanicus. Why should he, a man who had never feared to tell even Caesar Augustus when he thought him wrong, suddenly stoop to murder in secret, and by such cowardly means as poison? Had he not once been considered a potential successor to Augustus? Yet even then, Augustus knew that Piso, a proud and noble member of the patrician Calpurniae Pisonis, disdained the absolute rule of one man. Finally, Piso offered those gathered around Sentius Saturninus the opportunity to join him. A young signifer, the soldier charged with holding and displaying the standard of his cohort, broke ranks. Moved by Piso's last stand, the young man dropped his standard and raced up the hill toward Celenderis. Immediately following this breach of protocol, Sentius Saturninus restored discipline, ordering his legions to pull back from Celenderis, thus ending any further communication between Piso and his men. With an army of deserters, mercenaries and slaves brandishing weapons that ranged from military issue to pitchforks, the civil war of Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso ended before the first drop of blood was shed. Surrendering his fortress to Sentius Saturninus, Piso requested permission to take Plancina and their young son Marcus back to Rome to prepare for trial. Having only performed his duties to Rome and the Senate, Piso was certain he could easily defend himself. Sentius Saturninus granted the request, and so Piso, with his wife and youngest son, boarded a ship and set sail for Italy. For Tiberius, the standoff at Celenderis was concluded. The soldiers involved in Piso's rebellion would be appropriately punished, and Sentius Saturninus would remain as governor of both Cilicia and Syria, restoring order to the region. But with Agrippina's growing dirge slowly closing in on Rome, and Piso and his family now returning to stand trial, the next war was about to begin, a war of popular opinion and legal retribution that, if not managed properly, could expose the cracks in the ever-fragile balance of power Tiberius had been entrusted to maintain.